I'm now going to introduce Richard. Richard is a PhD candidate at Durham University here in the UK. His doctoral research examines affective power and sensory perception in the works of Francisco de Zurbarán, who was a Spanish artist who worked in the early 17th century. And he's exploring how Zurbarán's preoccupation with verisimilitude and tactile painterly effects addresses the spiritual needs and psychological views of his drives of his viewers. Prior to moving to Durham, Richard completed an MA at the Courtauld Institute, where his research focused on the graphic art of Gaspar de Serra, who was a 16th century Spanish artist, and the influence of Italian concepts of diseño in 16th century Spain. So Richard, thank you so much for joining me tonight. I was just saying to Richard, I know from Richard's posts on Instagram that Richard knows an awful lot about religious art, Christian religious art in particular. And I'm always really amazed at his posts. I always read them with great interest and enjoyment. And I feel although I'm an art historian myself, and I do often work on religious paintings, I feel really a pygmy compared to Richard in terms of my knowledge of this iconography. So I'm going to be asking him a lot of questions and hoping he'll give us the answers.
That's a very generous introduction. Thank you.
We're going to be looking at about 6 episodes, in fact, from the Passion of Christ, from the Easter story, with about 2 or 3 artworks in each, because we decided that what we would do is pick some of our favorite paintings and sculptures and compare some of them in terms of different and different centuries. So some of the work from some from Italy, and indeed other places around presenting the story, and so at different techniques to try and think about how these artworks responded to the religious and cultural concerns of their patrons and audiences. So the first work that we're going to talk about, the first works that we're going to look at, are The Last Supper by Leonardo da Vinci, which is an incredibly famous work of art. I'm sure you've all seen images of it, even if you've never seen it in person. And we're also going to talk about a painting which Richard has chosen, a Spanish version of it by Juan de Juanes, who was a Valencian painter from the 16th century. So Richard, tell us what's happening in Da Vinci's Last Supper in particular, and is it the same thing that's happening in Juan de Juanes?
Well, they may look very similar, and many people speculate that Juan de Juanes may well have seen Leonardo's great work, at least in copies or in drawings. He may have gone to Italy and seen it himself, just because of this extraordinary attention to symmetry and light and perspective in the issues. But they're actually doing rather different things. If we look at Leonardo's work first, well, the obvious thing to say is they're all sitting on one side of the table, but what Leonardo's keen to do is to capture these various expressions on the disciples' faces, and they're reacting to something. And if you just scan across all of these figures, you can hear almost this very animated conversation as they react. And what are they reacting to? Well, it's thought they're reacting to Jesus's identification of Judas, who is the only one with his elbow on the table, rude manners, he's identified him as the person who will be betraying him. He's reached for a piece of bread, and Judas has reached for another piece, because it's, of course, in the sign of Judas picking up a piece of bread and dipping it in his plate that will identify him as the traitor. So he said there's a traitor in our midst. He hasn't actually pointed the finger at Judas, and they're all just wondering what on earth is going on. This tight group of disciples, brothers who've been with him on the road, are now hearing this for the first time, that one is going to betray them. And that's the moment that Leonardo is capturing. He does it with a number of... Sorry.
Go ahead now. I think you're going to answer. You're going to answer my next question. So,
well, he does it with a rather extraordinary effect. As we can see, the whole picture is focused on the person of Jesus, but he does it not just by putting him just slightly separate from the other group and at the center of our picture, but also this is really one of those first great pictures that everything is about perspective. Everything is about establishing lines of sight going further and further into the painting, and a vanishing point. And that vanishing point and those perspectival lines all come together on Jesus's right cheek. Of course, that is the cheek that Judas will kiss a little later in our story in the Garden of Gethsemane as the site of the actual betrayal. And so there's all sorts of symbolism to tell us that this is about that absolute act of betrayal, and that's what's created this extraordinary scene.
And how do we know this? I mean, where does this iconography come from? It goes a long way back, doesn't it? It goes right back to the catacombs. There is a depiction, I believe, in one of the catacombs of a people seated along a table, isn't there?
Indeed, and we're looking at it. It's a very ancient way of also addressing this scene, with everyone almost sort of lined up on the other side of a table in the Last Supper, and obviously this act has been of the Last Supper has been critical to the development of the Christian faith and the Catholic tradition up to this point, where it becomes the central act of worship within the church being lived out in this moment. So it resonates in all sorts of ways.
Because there were different depictions then later, weren't there? So we'll see that Juan de Juanes keeps the same format, but there were also, I know, depictions in Spanish art, for example, of people sitting around round tables or sitting around rectangular tables, where you see the backs of the apostles, and you see the back of Judas. And I remember one Spanish painting in particular where you see a little bag of money at his feet. You know, the money that he got for betraying Jesus. Is that right?
Yes, it is, and it becomes that becomes a real symbol. The easy way to pick out Judas is that money. He was, of course, the treasurer, which was his role, so he was always to have the bag of money. But of course, it goes to the money that he also got, the pieces of silver that he had for the betrayal. Should we move to
Juan de Juanes now and tell us why you like this painting so much?
Well, this painting is doing something different. This isn't really about Judas's betrayal, although you can spot him because he's often portrayed with red hair, and he's at the far right of our picture. The rest of the disciples all have their names very conveniently penned in their halos. Judas doesn't have a halo because he's the traitor, but so he is sitting on his name. It's penned in his stool, if you look very carefully. But this painting is doing something different. This is really coming back to the whole point of the Last Supper, which was the institution of the Mass, where Jesus says, "This is my body and this is my blood." And really, what we're seeing is Jesus as a sort of priest at the altar. He's doing what every priest would do in the Catholic Church of the time. Lifting up, elevating the host, which becomes his body. And you can see it doesn't look like bread, it looks like a host. More interestingly is the cup that's directly in front of him. To my great surprise, when I first went to Valencia and walked into Valencia Cathedral, I did the tour and came to the end, and then I entered the chapel that contained the cup that Jesus is allegedly used, I say allegedly, at the Last Supper, the Holy Grail, which I had always thought was something that I was never going to see with my eyes, but there it is in Valencia. It's made of agate, mounted on a golden, and you can see it today, and it is exactly the cup that is in front of Jesus now. So Juanes, who paints this in picture in Valencia, is making some claims for Valencia and their claim to have the Holy Grail. But he's actually painting a work that is really to re-establish the Catholic Mass at the heart of the Christian faith. Remember, he's painting this only 50 years after Leonardo, but of course in that 50 years, the Reformation has begun to take a hold.
Right.
And so he's bringing us back to essentially what are the essentials of, as he would see, the faith, which is the act of communion. He's also done something else we see in a lot of art of this period. He's conflated a number of stories. So if that's right at the heart, we've got Judas looking as if he's about to make a quick escape to go and betray Jesus. So looking forward to what is going to happen. But right in the forefront of the picture, you see the big ewer and the basin, which of course is the other part of what happens in the upper room at the Last Supper, which is where Jesus washes the feet of his disciples. So he's telling us a sort of fuller narrative of things that have happened in the washing of the feet, the theological meaning of the Last Supper, and we're about to see Judas scurry off to do the act of betrayal.
Right. Okay, shall we move on to our next comparison, so the next episode, the Agony in the Garden? Tell us about the Agony in the Garden, first of all. And we've got two paintings here. One is Italian, Mantegna, which you can see if you're in London at the National Gallery. And the other is El Greco, who again, well, he was from Cyprus? No, Crete. He was from Crete and moved via Italy and ended up in Spain, in Toledo. And so, but he spent time in Italy. So one of the interesting things to compare these two images is, had El Greco seen Mantegna's or either Mantegna's version of it or his brother-in-law Bellini's version of it, which is also at the National Gallery. But perhaps first you can tell us a little bit about what's going on in these scenes, Richard.
So this takes place in the Garden of Gethsemane, where Jesus has gone to pray after the Last Supper before he is arrested. He asks the disciples to wait with him while he goes to pray, and finds, of course, that they've drifted off to sleep. He wakes them again, tells them to wait with him. They drift off to sleep, and he goes to a quiet place in the garden where he says to his father, take this cup away from me, but if it's your will, do it. I'll go along with this. So it's a critical moment where Jesus is being portrayed, being fully aware of his fate and the work he must do. And of course, it's an unpleasant work. It's a work that no one would want to take on. So that's why this is in a real sense an agony. It's one of those extraordinary moments in anyone's life where you're confronted with a very uncomfortable truth of something you have to do, but you don't. You wish it would pass from you, but it's not going to. So that's what Jesus is doing, and talking to the angels and saying, if this is, I'd rather not have the cup, but if it is my will to drink from this cup, then your will be done. But of course, in the background to these both these pictures, you can see the party coming to get him, and the moment of decision is really fully upon us in these two campuses, but done in very different ways. I mean, Mantegna, you have to just revel at the detail of his painting. I don't know if people can see on their screens, but right just by the feet of one of the disciples that's lying down, there are two rabbits confronting each other.
Yes.
There's a whole life in this painting that you really just want to get your eye into, because lots of these animals would have had significance within the story as well.
and Mantegna, I think, was beginning to look at some of the Netherlandish art that was arriving in Italy from via patrons that had contacts in Bruges, or sometimes were working in Bruges, and were importing the work of Roger van der Weyden and Van Eyck and other Netherlandish artists, weren't they? And Mantegna is sort of trying to recreate that sense of naturalism that you're getting in those early Netherlandish paintings, isn't he?
Exactly, and the skill of him to do it, because we've tried to say what these are made of, because the things that works of art are making of is also important. He's still working in egg tempera on wood, and of course many of those Netherlandish paintings are already working in oil, which gives you a lot more ability to create all of this detail.
Yes.
So you know, hats off to Mantegna. He is within the tools that he's got, he is able to reproduce this exquisite detail that makes these pictures very rich and very powerful. But he then uses other tools. If you think about the effect on you of looking at these craggy rocks, you can see the city of Jerusalem there, but look at these menacing, sharp rocks, very architectural there, but they're intended to give you a sense of the horror. And then, of course, that's one of the reasons why you must wonder whether El Greco saw this, because he wants to frame Jesus within one of those sort of cavernous, craggy rocks to enhance the whole sense of almost a sort of rough claustrophobia.
Absolutely, and you're right. The composition is so similar, isn't it? In terms of the way that he positions the Judas and the party going to betray him in the back, and the sleeping disciples on that side, and the angel up there to the top left. But he does it in a very different way. His technique is really, or his imagery is very, very different. El Greco, isn't it? This sort of this visionary representation of the event. It's much
Indeed.
more of a supernatural event, isn't it?
Absolutely, as if we are watching almost a dream. I mean, one of the things you can see is, firstly, all of that sort of fine detail of accurately wrought bunnies and wizened trees are all gone here. We're now looking at big blocks of colour and almost the different parts of the story all merging into one. I mean, you can't really tell what the angel is sitting on or in what space the disciples are sleeping in, but it gives you just the impression, which is why, of course, his work became so important to later schools of art, because he was willing to work in this impressionistic manner.
Yes, because you almost don't have a sense of where the horizon is. It's still faintly there. I mean, that goes in his later paintings. You have no sense at all, and everything is just floating. There is still a sense in the sort of bottom and the sort of middle right of a landscape that is kind of tethered to the earth. But the light is absolutely supernatural. And I was thinking a lot about El Greco for a lecture I gave at the Courtauld recently, and I was looking at, at comparing it to St. Augustine's description of the soul illuminated by divine light. And he was very interested, wasn't he? I mean, he was a very erudite man. He had a lot of, when he died, his library was full of books of treatises and of books of the early church fathers and philosophers. And I think he thought a lot about this question of divine light and what is the soul, and how does the soul express, how does the soul manifest itself, and what is it? So these kind of silvery light and these vaporous clouds is very characteristic, isn't it, of El Greco? And it's so different from, as we were saying, the much more naturalistic. I mean, obviously Mantegna does depict the little angel sitting on the cloud, but otherwise it's a very earthly scene, isn't it?
It is, and obviously, El Greco never quite leaves his Cretan heritage behind, and that ability to create particularly religious iconographies without being tied to earthly perspectives. just in the way that an icon, which we'll come on to think about later, seems to be one of those objects in our lives that move freely between reality and a spiritual dimension.
Yeah. Let's move to our next comparison. But we have some close-ups. I should have shown them to you, but let's move to our next comparison, or our next set of paintings, which is the really the Veronica, or the head of Christ. So I chose the Petrus Christus on the left, and Richard chose the Zurbarán Veronica on the right. The reason that I chose the Petrus Christus is because it's a version of a lost painting by Jan van Eyck, who produced a head of Christ, which became very, very famous and was often reproduced, although we no longer have the original painting. We have lots of copies and versions of what we think the original painting looked like. And I'm particularly fond of this one by Petrus Christus. And I'm very interested in when Van Eyck actually, we'll come back to the Zurbarán in a minute, but when Van Eyck painted his version, it seemed to reflect the fact that the work, which was thought to be the actual the Veronica, or the veil in which Christ's face was imprinted with his sweat when Saint Veronica followed him on the route to Calvary. There's an image that's now in the Vatican, which is thought to be that very imprint. That is thought to be the Veronica. We actually date it to the 13th century, but the belief was that it came from, I think, from Constantinople to the Vatican. And, believers think that this work, what is what's called an akarapiton, if I'm pronouncing that correctly, a miraculously made image. So, the sweat of Christ imprinted onto the cloth, which is framed in this gold frame at the Vatican. There's another image also of another similar image, which is in Genoa, which is these are known as mandilions. And the mandilion in Genoa has a different origin story. This one is actually thought to have been made by Christ himself. There was a king in Edessa, which is in modern Turkey, who was ill and asked for Christ to send an image to heal himself. I believe. I think that was the reason. And Christ actually sent him an image which he created of his own face, and sent it to the king of Edessa. So both of these images are these miraculous images, and I think that Van Eyck was trying to express that sense of a miraculous man-made image, which then got copied by all these other Netherlandish and Spanish artists. Indeed, these images were traveling all over Europe. So should we talk about the Zurbarán now, Richard, and how that relates to these?
So the Veronica was a very popular thought in religious culture from the Middle Ages onwards, and you can find, once you start looking for Veronicas, you can see them in almost any passion scene, tapestry, carvings. They suddenly start appearing. So Zurbarán was hitting very fertile ground when he decided to have a go at this image. And in fact, they were very successful for him. This is one of 12, we think, were largely by his own hand, and many more by his studio. So they were commercially a very successful image. But he's trying to do something rather different with it. If Van Eyck and his followers are trying to capture something that they can say is a real expression of the Veronica, Zurbarán doesn't seem to want to worry about that. He's given us a much more freehand version of Christ himself, the head of Christ within the cloth itself, but one which seems to almost capture our attention. It's as if he's sort of done a snapshot of Christ on the move. the eyes engage with us in a way that is quite realistic. Again, very sketchy brush strokes to create these images, but they are very engaging. But of course, that's only one part of, in a way, the magic that Zurbarán wants to work with this, because what he's really done is made us marvel at his ability to paint the white cloth. I hope you can see it in this image, but it is a spectacular ability to bring to life in front of our eyes drapery. And he had techniques for doing this. Plaster of Paris came into play, so he could actually mold these and work from them. But he was able to really trick the eye with this tour de force of drapery. But even within the drapery, you find things that are supposed to bring you back to the sense of the passion. You probably won't be able to see it too clearly from the image on your screen, but I'll just tell you that two of the most extraordinary marks on this whole painting are the bright brass pins that are tacked into the cloth, and they're quite deliberate, and they're there to make us think of the nails of the passion. They're also equally wonderful are those very thin threads that are very tightly around the top corners of the cloth and strung up. And the whole act of display against this piercingly black background becomes part of his technique to try to give this image of the crucified Christ a real meaning. And of course, the cloth is also, of course, the cloth of the shroud, the things that the dead body is wrapped upon. So he's given us lots of visual clues in what is actually a very ordinary, everyday piece of white cloth, to, in a sense, bring it much closer to people's everyday experience than perhaps the miraculous one-off images that seek to get their credibility from a replication of the Mandellion, the actual original relic sitting in so-called relic sitting in the Vatican. So he's used a different tool and a different set of experiences to try to bring this moment. Christ on the way to Calvary takes the cloth from Veronica, and it becomes a sort of living relic of the Passion coming down through the ages. And in this sort of rather extraordinary display that Zurbarán creates, he tries to give you something of the everyday that can be reflected upon and bring you back into that moment.
Yes, he really was the master of white cloth. One of my favorite paintings of all time is his Saint Serapion. That wonderful painting. I don't know if our viewers have seen it, but he was a saint, and he's a martyr. There's absolutely no blood in it, but he's wearing this extraordinary set of robes in white, and there's just a slash in the robe which really tells you everything you need to know, and he's sort of almost crucified, but it's totally bloodless, and it's such a powerful painting. It's this use of white cloth. Shall we move to our next set of, which are also Spanish, and one is also by Zurbarán. So here we've compared a sculpture by Juan de Mesa, who was a 17th century Sevillian sculptor, and Zurbarán, who was also working in Seville at the same time and had no doubt seen Juan de Mesa's sculptures. And well, I'm going to let Richard talk about this, because I think Juan de Mesa was a rather wonderful, there was, as some of you may have seen the exhibition at the National Gallery 10 years ago or so, called The Sacred Made Real, where Xavier Bray really brought to our attention how the relationship between these polychrome sculptures and the paintings that were being produced at the same time in Seville, and how many of the painters, including Zurbarán, learnt to paint sculpture. I mean, I don't think we have physical evidence that Zurbarán polychromed a work, but we certainly have evidence that Velázquez did, because Velázquez trained in the workshop of Francisco Pacheco, who was polychroming sculpture. So the relationship between these works is a very very close one. But tell us about the Zurbarán, Richard.
Well, and as we look at these two works, I would just ask viewers to think about which to them looks the most real, because there is a real interplay, and there was at the time a real conversation about what was the greater of the art forms, sculpture and sculptural forms, or painting. So while I talk about it, have a think about that. One of the things I think that's really interesting when you show people images of the crucifixion, again, rather like when we started and we were looking at the Last Supper, there's always a moment to think, what are we really looking at here? Well, actually, what we're looking at here is two dead bodies. We know that Christ at this point has died not just because his head is bowed as his last breath has gone, but you can also see in his chest the piercing of the spear that was done to see whether he'd actually died or not, and blood and water came forth from his side according to the Bible. So we're looking at a dead body. And you have to bear that in mind. People always want to sort of look at these things and say, well, he's bearing his suffering happily or peacefully, but actually we're seeing a dead Christ in front of us in these two particular images. Coming to the Zurbarán image, he was trying very much to vie with the sculptured form. In fact, his earliest biographers said that many people, when this was first displayed, and this is one of his first works, I mean, talk about give your best paint, almost your best painting. Amazing. At the very outset. Yeah. This was his first major commission in Seville, painted for a chapel in the Dominican church in Seville. And his earliest biographer tells us that people just thought it was a sculpture. They looked at it and couldn't believe it was at the back of a chapel that they couldn't quite get to, so they didn't have great light on it, but what they saw convinced them they were looking at a sculpture, and that's very purposeful. But he's also very keen to show the reality of the situation. In the last pictures, in the sculptures, we saw a rather different view of Christ's feet, a very traditional view, one nail through both feet. One of the masters you've already mentioned, Pacheco, was a great sort of thinker about art in early 17th century Seville, said, no, they can't possibly have been that. You can't make it happen. He had to have been, there had to be two nails. He had to have had both feet nailed. So we begin to see in this effort to make things as real as possible, because if we can present them as real, people can actually really engage with them and begin to believe in them, because they have nothing but to see with their eyes. So we can begin to see artists like Zurbarán following Pacheco's advice and putting two nails in the feet. But again, we come to that white cloth. He's using it to create tension in the picture. How on earth does it hold up? We've all been in places where we've had towels around us that don't quite hold up, and it brings tension to our bodies, and you can see that in the way that white cloth, is it about to fall? How tightly is it bound around Christ? And also, of course, how realistically has he managed to get all of those folds and to stay there? It's quite a miracle of itself in all of that. And to your point about St. Serapion, this picture he painted of a martyr without blood, well, for people who think that Spanish art is all about blood and gore, you have to look at Zurbarán, because he manages to convey all the pathos of the crucifixion with virtually no visible signs of blood. That's not his way. It's done in silence. It's done in the twisted forms of that cloth. And we need to say nothing more than this extraordinary sadness of seeing a dead body in front of us brought to life in two dimensions.
It's an incredibly beautiful body too, isn't it? I mean, that's rather fascinating when I think of the Netherlandish Christs that preceded, and that many civilian painters were influenced by, that were much more gaunt and much more suffering. Zurbarán's Christ as those of Martínez Montañés, who were very, very beautiful, especially Zurbarán's. Anyway, let's move to the next, and I think this is probably my favorite set of comparisons here. Both of these paintings are, I think, two of the most extraordinary paintings ever produced. So on the left, Roger van der Weyden's Descent from the Cross, and on the right, Michelangelo's Entombment. I mean, I chose the Descent. I just think it's one of those extraordinary paintings. I don't know if any of our viewers have been to Madrid and seen it in the Prado, but every time I go and see it, there's always so many people in front of it. I think it's a painting that just takes your breath away. And it's a painting which apparently people do cry in front of. I think there's been a whole book written about people crying in front of this painting, because it's so, you know, it really grabs you, and it sort of shows you how to express emotion. There's so many different reactions to this event, and you know, some of them crying, some of the bodies contorted with emotion, some of them looking just sad, the Virgin swooning. You know, I mean, Van der Weyden was really extraordinary. And I liked very much, I'll just read you a quick quote from Lorne Campbell, who used to be the curator of the National Gallery, who has written many books about Roger van der Weyden and is probably the best, I think the best art historian to really discuss him ever. And he said, he describes magnificently, but by exploiting the expressive power of lines, angles, shapes, and colors, he increases or enhances emotional reactions. By creating ambiguities of space and scale, he induces disturbing feelings of unease. He seems anxious to make us think about levels of reality, about imagination in both its 15th century senses of image making and fantasy, and so on. And he says, in certain ways, Roger has more in common with Matisse or the Picasso of Guernica than with his contemporaries, which is an extraordinary statement, isn't it?
I've always found this hauntingly claustrophobic. I mean, it's a very odd-shaped painting, and how he's managed to get, of course, the more you look at it, the more you realize that they're all very unreal figures that he's squeezed in. I mean, the Virgin is so long that her body sort of covers up the bottom of the cross, quite deliberately covers up the bottom of the cross, so you can't get your bearings with any form of sort of perspective. But it just feels that also that Jesus, who is more or less shaped in exactly the same way as the Virgin already on the floor, is about to fall on her. It's just so uncomfortable.
Yeah.
And they're all crying.
They're tipping out of the box.
Oh, but I think two figures in this picture are actually crying, and they look as if they're shedding really heartfelt tears. Just in the way when you see, you know, I'm one of those people that cries in front of the television. If I see lots of people crying, I just get carried up. But you know, all these centuries before, he's managed to do it. Yeah, yeah.
And of course, the Michelangelo is just such an extraordinary painting. So tell us about what actually is happening. What moment are we seeing here?
Yeah, so if Roger van der Weyden is the Descent from the Cross, and you can literally see Nicodemus and Joseph from Arimathea and a boy helping him, you know, sort of taking him down. Here we're in a slightly more uncertain territory. It's called the Entombment of Christ. Caravaggio painted it at the beginning of the 17th century. It isn't an entombment because there is no tomb. They seem to be putting him down on a slab, and so perhaps we are at that point before he was actually placed in the tomb, when his body was about to be anointed. The other people in the picture at the back are Mary, his mother, Mary Magdalene, and Mary, the mother of James and John. And he's done lots of wonderful things here, but I think that the most extraordinary thing is the idea that Jesus is being laid on a slab. His hand, his sort of limp hand, is already touching the cold stone slab that he's about to be laid on. Again, this was painted for an altar in the church of St. Philip Neri, who'd recently had died in Rome. And this was, of course, going to be in front of the priest celebrating Mass. And so this really is about Jesus's body being placed on the slab of the altar. And that's what the priest would have seen during Mass as he raised the host. So this is very much a picture that is better to understand if you could see it in its original context. It's now in the Vatican museums. And of course, as Jesus is being placed on the altar, Mary Magdalene has her arms looking up to God in heaven. So we've got that sort of whole movement that happens within the Mass happening in front of us. Things that people don't often notice in this picture, right at the bottom you can see a plant. It's called mullein, and it's a plant thought to have many healing properties, and quite deliberately placed there by Caravaggio. Again, rather unusual, an almost unblemished body of Jesus.
Beautiful,
beautiful in many respects, and showing none of the torments of the Passion. This is
no blood.
much more like a resurrection body.
Yes,
in its perfection.
Yes. Well, let's
also worth noticing Mary, who is usually shown young, whatever age she was, even at the end of her life. Caravaggio is having none of that. He paints her as an older mother, who she would have been, as we know, at this point in the life of Christ.
I have to say, in this painting, the thing that always amazes me are the hands. You know, these hands at the top, the hand at the side, the hands at the bottom. It's just, you know, framed by hands. I think we're running a little bit over time, so let's just move to the last very quickly. Let's just talk about the last, the resurrection. Whoops, sorry, I'm just seem to have gone back there. I chose the Bouts resurrection because I love, again, Bouts. As you can see, I'm a real fan of early Netherlandish art, but I think it's a very beautiful painting. Again, it's an iconography, which I believe goes back to the catacombs, but there are different sort of versions of it. But would you like to tell us about the Murillo painting, Richard, since we haven't got very much time, and I'd like to give some time to the audience to ask questions if they'd like to.
So Murillo comes, he is, in a sense, takes over from Zurbarán as the most important painter in Seville in the middle of the 17th century. He's, by this point, by the time he painted this, he's been to Madrid as well and seen work of Titian and Raphael preserved in the royal collections there. He's seen the Netherlandish arts, and all of that goes into confecting a rather timeless piece of art that it's hard to know where it's really from. But what he's keen to do is to use light to communicate the resurrection. So this extraordinary backdrop of behind Christ, there's a light that almost goes right through him and illuminates the viewer. So he's used a very subtle palette to be able to communicate Christ almost as a sort of flash of light to communicate the sense of the resurrection, and a wonderful sense of movement up towards the heavens. A very triumphal moment, made all the more extraordinary by the reality of these foreshortened guards right at the front of the picture, which come into our space. So they're the real bit. They're the things that make us sort of bring us down to earth. But we're confronted by this ascending, resurrected, triumphant Christ that just is bathed in the most extraordinary golden light.